Should global governments be improving access to psychedelic substances? Well, we know this is already happening in certain territories around the world. Today we have on legal counsel that's going to unpack the development of psychedelics in South Africa. This is not just a South African conversation, this is truly a global one. We've seen the Privacy Acts for cannabis being allowed for home cultivation in South Africa. Will we potentially see a future where we could see psychedelic substances like psilocybe mushrooms cultivated at home and general access to other psychedelics? Well, that's what we're going to discuss today. In addition, we're going to compare rights of access through medical versus just general constitutional rights. Further, we're going to have a look at the history of psychedelic laws that really enacted this prohibitionist stance. And really, we discuss the future of what psychedelics could be when taken out of UN restrictions. Hi, today we have on Paul Michael Kaikol from Cullinan and Associates, who's going to tackle the topic of psychedelics in South Africa. Now, there's been a lot of developments around cannabis legislation, but increasingly the question has been raised by seeing what happens around the world. What is going to happen to instances regarding other psychedelics? Mushrooms is a clear candidate with psilocybin, but there's certainly more. Paul Michael, glad to have you on today.
Thank you, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be on, and you're certainly right. It's something that we have neglected insofar as talking about it, and we do need to start talking about it more because it's coming and it's the logical next step after what we've achieved in cannabis.
Awesome. So let's go to a practical first question. I mean, this is something that people may have wondered about. What happens right now in this instance where if you are, for instance, let's say you have a psilocybe mushroom with you and you get caught with that. Firstly, if the police can identify it, kudos. But if they have identified it, what is the standard position from the law regarding this? And then maybe where have there been some instances where the law and the argument for self-determination has bumped heads?
Jeff, so really in summary, the position that you'd find yourself in is the same as if you were caught with cannabis pre the 2018 Constitutional Court judgment. The Drugs and Drugs Trafficking Act schedules psilocybin and a whole handful of other psychedelics in the same way as it treated cannabis, and in fact, some instances more harshly than cannabis. These are viewed as either dependence-producing or undesirable dependence-producing drugs, or dangerous dependence-producing drugs with no medicinal benefits. So if you're caught in possession of it, well, then that is, it's a criminal offense in terms of Section 4 of the Drugs Act. And if you're dealing in it, well, then it's an offense in terms of Section 5 of the Drugs Act. So you could find yourself being prosecuted, and if you are successfully prosecuted, doing jail time or facing heavy fines and whatnot. But much like the lead up to the cannabis judgment, there are a number of people around the country who have been able to obtain what we call stays in prosecution. So the national prosecuting authorities have made a decision to prosecute, and then you run off to the High Court and you say, hold on, this person, and I'm going to mention her by name, Monica Cromhout, is going to be going to court and constitutionally challenging the prohibition on, or the criminal prohibition on medicinal mushrooms, as we sometimes call them. And so I don't want to be prosecuted until we've had an outcome, a yes or a no on that constitutional challenge. So that is probably your best option if you are arrested for an associated crime or an alleged associated crime.
Yeah. So take us to this. I mean, this constitutional right, because I mean, it has strong parallels with cannabis in terms of, we've seen other jurisdictions. We will maybe touch on that, but I mean, we've seen Portugal take a radical stance on, softening and being more lenient when it comes to soft drugs and general drugs. Canada has definitely done some reforms in certain provinces. Like, where are we in terms of the constitutional rights, related to this, and maybe unpack what that right is relative to your right to, it's your body, at the end of the day.
Absolutely. So the first thing to say is that the Constitutional Court hung its hat in respect of cannabis on the right to privacy. It just, in my opinion, it was something that was easy enough to do, but it didn't really start unpacking this concept, as we like to call it, of cognitive liberty, which I would argue is correctly interpreted, already found within our Constitution, which is to say that what one does to one's body it's a freedom that every adult possesses. And similarly, how one goes about changing one's consciousness, even through the use of or the ingestion of a hallucinogen is again an adult freedom. So if you read the two constitutional rights together, psychological and bodily integrity, the right to change one's mind. We say that these are off limits from the state. Now, what our constitution says is, in summary, again, I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty detail, but if the state is going to purport through its laws to limit any one of the rights contained in the Bill of Rights of the Constitution, then it needs to have bloody good reason to do so. And the state, in fact, has the onus of justifying that prohibition. So what is typically argued by the South African state is, well, we're protecting you from yourself because all of these things are incredibly harmful and they cause addiction and they cause the degradation of civil society and all sorts of social evils. But unfortunately, this has been proved in the last few decades to be 1960s, 1970s propaganda. There isn't a scientific or a social study that backs any of these allegations. So really what we're betting on is that the state is going to have a very, very hard time justifying, as it's obliged to do, maintaining criminal prohibition over these things.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good point. I mean, it makes me think of obviously the work of Albert Hofman on LSD and, working for Sandoz and the early rollout where they essentially provided LSD in, quite decent quantities to psychiatrists, clinicians for, basically experimental development, and then how that actually went. We think of Timothy Leary and Ram Dass, where it kind of escaped from Harvard and it kind of maybe took some skews and that church experiments and the rest. But I kind of, it does bring me to the point where if it wasn't for, for instance, that 1970 specific period where we then pushed, and the US primarily pushed, to introduce the 1971 aspect around psychoactive products, not just narcotic drugs, and get it classified in that. I mean, it stopped and halted the progress of so many interesting, especially psychedelic assisted psychotherapy procedures. And we've seen the resurgence. And I think Canada is a good jurisdiction. Maybe we can focus on, we've seen this blossoming of, even clinical studies. Now, I think MAPS is a good example because MAPS is an organization that has done a lot for a long time. And their MDMA, which is obviously a slightly different psychedelic than what psilocybin would typically be compared to. But even with psilocybin and things like MDMA, which is already at phase 3, we are expecting, the global community is expecting authorization medically of these products clinically for indications like PTSD or major depressive disorder. We've even seen a clinical study in South Africa on, the first subset of women getting a psilocybin-based therapy for major depressive disorder. Are we going to have to wait for this medical framework to be introduced first before we actually see these stays of prosecution being dissolved over time? What's your view on the iteration and the rollout here? Is it going to be that we're solely dependent on medical, or is somewhere the law going to allow us to be responsible with our own rights? Yeah.
Well, the fight fundamentally is around allowing adults to be in control of their own health, their own mental health, what they put into their bodies, etc. That's not to say that we would have any problem with a traditional pharmaceutical company saying, all right, well, we've got the cleanest extraction and we have formulated this into a concoction that is specifically good for the following ailments, etc., etc. And then you have to run the usual gauntlets, the SAPRA gauntlets of registering a medicine, and then it's only available to you via a registered pharmacist in response to a script from a medical doctor. All fine if that's the path that you want to take on getting your hands on what you decide is an effective medicine. But similarly, if you are a depressed person and you have done your research and you've decided that consuming a mushroom that hasn't gone through SAPRA and hasn't been grown in a GMP facility, you've made the adult decision that this might help you with your treatment-resistant depression. We're saying that unless the state can justify preventing you from doing so, that is a right. And for that matter, we're saying that it's a right that is afforded to sick in addition to healthy people. So not only do you have the right to self-medicate, you have the right to self-elevate. Who's to say that you have to prove to a psychiatrist or a psychologist that you are sick or depressed in order to be able to improve your life through ingesting a mushroom or ayahuasca or LSD or any other number of these scientifically very low harm entheogens.
Yeah, perfect. I love that because I brought that aspect in on the science of it because, I mean, it's been well demonstrated the relative safety where you should moderate the dose. LSD is extremely powerful. So, there should be guidelines. But I completely agree that sense of elevation. Like, why should a person not be? I mean, this just makes me think of the Renaissance period where, it was about exploration and it was about establishing the bounds and exploring the psyche and the mind. And not everything has to be like end of life scenarios or severe depression for you to benefit from microdosing an active compound that's from nature for the most part. Is available, and we have receptors in the body that correspond and relate to this. And I think there's been some really inspired work throughout history that traces itself back to these experiences with psychedelics. And I think it's almost a shame to be in such a modern era and to see a bit still this 1960s, 1970s restrictive framework on, a big argument has been made that the reason these policies were introduced is because there was a dropout of nonconformance, like especially around the Vietnam War. So, there was a strong motivator to keep people in line. And that's just not society anymore. I mean, society is far more encompassing at the moment. How do you see areas like Oregon? We know that Oregon, the US state, has taken a more progressive stance on the use and rollout of psychedelics, not just decriminalization, but other aspects. Could you give it a bit of a context there of how you maybe see their decision making in the region?
Absolutely. Firstly, to say, yeah, you've touched on really the fear-based decision making that occurred in the early 1970s, and you also mentioned Timothy Leary. It's an incredible man, and one can look back on him and think, wow, he was trying to achieve something socially beautiful, this almost like spiritual artistic movement, the intersect of art and science. But I just don't think that the 1960s and the early 1970s politically was ready for such a man. And we've wasted something like 50 years now when it comes to the elevation of the human psyche because of that fear-based response. And places like Oregon, they are the leaders, and they're the leaders in correcting what I think time will prove to be a massive misstep in the history of humanity, or at least in the history of Western society. Because what they're doing now is that they are focusing on exactly what we've been talking about, this right to self-medicate and the right to self-medicate, without running the gauntlet of having to, distill this into a dropper form or a pill form and register this with, whatever medicinal authority might be the case in country to country, in our case, SAPRA. So what you're seeing now is that not only decriminalized, but in fact regulated and legalized is the right as an adult to say, all right, well, I like the sound and the look of that shaman or that spiritual healer, or for that matter, even that medical doctor. And this person can now approach that individual or that association and go through a guided psychedelic experience that is very, very well curated, that ensures that not only do they go in mentally and psychologically prepared for the experience, but there's also this very necessary process of integration post-experience. So you have your held hand through the 6 or 8 hours that you are under the influence of the drug itself. But for weeks afterwards, these people are going through intensive integration, which is the psychological process of saying, all right, well, in that slightly altered state, I came to the following realizations about my history, about my future, about my way of doing things. I don't necessarily want to keep doing things destructively in this manner. And these trained professionals, and when I say trained, I mean it's training through experience. They are there to make sure that people can extract the full benefits of these powerful and in some instances sacred chemicals.
Yeah, fully. I mean, I like that point. Like you're hitting a few points there that I enjoy because firstly, it doesn't have to be as regimented. Like people are going to get access, independent of, if someone wants to get access to these products, they will. So why not put associations in place? Why not put guided structures in place? So like you said, setting is so important, and the integration post the set and the setting, I think that's vital to the effectiveness of these, especially because it creates that neuroplasticity where you're able to rewire, overcome certain traumas, and look at like, okay, this is the way I want to look at conditioning my mind going forward. And it's not something that really is easily abused. I mean, these are powerful compounds, which means powerful in the sense that you will use them very intermittently. It's not like, say, for instance, cannabis, where daily use is something that's maybe more common. This is really, it's very infrequent. And I think it's because of the nature of these compounds that it's so infrequent, because it's so profound. But I think setting the environment is kind of where we should be focusing. And then maybe over time, we start to define, okay, acceptable cultivation practices, so that at least we know the quality sourcing makes sense. But to register as medicine is very unlikely, because the clinical pathway for this is so laborious, so intensive. It's not going to change the social aspect of how people are using this. And I think you hit those points really well in terms of, do you see potentially, what would it take for government to actually, and this is a big question, but what would it take for them to consider a practical approach like Oregon, where it's like, let's focus on the setting, on the training perhaps of that personnel, and potentially responsible sourcing, so that we know that it goes through some kind of responsible access. When it comes, I mean, how's it been? Is it being dispensed right now in Oregon? I mean, that's maybe a question that is a bit loaded. I'm throwing you off subject matter here.
I can't say that I know whether it's being dispensed, but I suppose it depends on your definition of dispensing. Yeah. I understand that these ceremonial settings now, the individuals and or the companies that are running these things are able to dispense or provide these scheduled substances to people lawfully in terms of license or in terms of regulation, whatever it is. But yeah, what will it take to convince government? I sound like a broken record here, and I'm trying my best to not sound too pessimistic about it. But after spending the last 10 years at least knowing what it's like to have to sue government, in an ideal world, we would be the participatory democracy that the Constitution says that we are. We ought to be able to lobby government and tell them that it's time to abandon these apartheid era laws and these Reagan era laws, and just do this for the benefit of the South African population. But unfortunately, what we've seen with cannabis and all other manner of human rights issues is that the only thing that one can really do is to sue government. You sue on the basis of alleging constitutional rights violations, and one hopes that one either wins in court or that the state capitulates. And on that front, I don't speak directly, but I've spoken to a fair number of counsel, high court advocates who deal in human rights litigation, and they're saying that at least since Ronald Lamola became Minister of Justice, the state attorney is being far more reasonable in electing what they oppose and what they allow to sort of just run its course through the courts. So at least during the Zuma era, things were a lot more difficult, because they would just oppose absolutely everything as a matter of course, without even interrogating as to why they were opposing it. So let's see. I mean, Monica Cromhout's case is going to be launched in the next few months. And sure, I don't know if anybody from the States is listening, but if you are, I'm encouraging you to capitulate.
Fair. I mean, that's a good point. I mean, on what basis is harm being done? Is there real harm to be looked at here? And thank you for that, Paul. Paul Michael, this has been insightful. I mean, I'm going to include your details as well for anyone who wants to reach out to Paul Michael Kitchell at Kellen and Associates. But I always enjoy our conversations. It's always so, it always feels like we're in a saloon in the Renaissance period where we talk about these radical ideas. They're not that radical on the surface. I mean, they're interesting. And the thing is, it's really, I think there's a community that's been built in South Africa and around the world that kind of sees it the same way, which is self-determination of your psyche. If we want to go into the metaverse, why are we not just going into the natural metaverse within ourselves first, before we invest in all this technology around creating virtual worlds when there's a perfectly good virtual world inside your mind that just needs further exploration. So thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. It's been a great conversation. And I'm looking forward to follow-ups, specifically on the case as well. And hopefully the state will capitulate and we will see more interesting developments in the field of psychedelics. And I'm hoping to do more content on this as well, ranging from the entire spectrum of products out there.
Thank you, Jeff. It's been a pleasure, and I'll always be keen to chat to you.
Awesome. Thanks. Now, I hope you're as fascinated as I am in the world of psychedelics. And if you want to join me on this journey of exploration as we bring on more guests and explore these topics, please subscribe, give me a like, and feel free to comment. I'd love to know what you think of this episode and what additionally you'd love to see on the channel.